So I think that's really true in sermons as well. Just the right image, the right story instead of the right time can really change how everyone's thinking and what they're thinking about. So just it's helpful to think about how to use media and multimedia and images and music in a sermon. Likewise, stories. It's helpful to insert a little story here and there. It re-grabs people's attention and it might lead them down a certain way of thinking. So it's got to be a relevant story though. It's got to raise some sort of relevant question, or it's got to demonstrate a particular relevant idea. So I used that story of going camping and throwing out the rice, and these birds came there, and there was this little squirrel which was standing out, and I used that to try to illustrate the idea of how Christians are meant to stand out in a crowd. And a few months back I used the story, when we talked about the parable of the sower, I thought of some university friends. I changed their names, but I used the story of how they lost their faith, and I thought that would help illustrate the parable. That was how I thought it would work. Hopefully it did. Stories can be pretty powerful, but they need to be relevant. It's easy to get a story wrong and pick a story that's not relevant, and I've done that plenty of times too. But if you think carefully, you can usually find a story that's relevant, and it's probably really important to make sure the story is appropriate, to not criticise other people or to share confidential information about someone else. So it's easy to get a story wrong in that way too. Within each scene, there might be a time to ask a question. A well-placed question can really encourage people to think and engage. It wakes people up, particularly if they think, I might be asked to answer a question. They're going to be paying more attention. So questions can be really good. But if the question's poorly constructed, it doesn't serve much purpose. And if it's poorly moderated, so if I'm standing up here asking a question and someone says something that's clearly theologically really dodgy, it runs the risk of making everyone feel uncomfortable or of bad theology being taught. So there's a skill in trying to moderate something and to respond to someone's answer to a question without making them feel bad, but at the same time redirecting it in the right way. And that's a skill that I'm not great at, but it's an important skill to develop.
Or you don't ask questions if you think you're going to have a pesky person.
That's right. In any particular scene, there might be a time when you think, actually it's important for me to do some direct teaching, to get some didactic teaching going, because if people don't understand who the Pharisees were, this passage won't make sense. If they don't understand what was happening in the history of Abraham at that stage, it won't make sense. So it's actually important in a particular scene, relevant scene, to do some didactic teaching when it's interesting. It's got to be interesting. There's no point saying a whole bunch of facts that aren't interesting, and when it's helpful. When it's relevant, when it's required. So teaching is really important, but it's got to be relevant, it's got to be required. If there's a whole bunch of really interesting facts that aren't relevant or aren't needed to really understand the passage, skip over them. Otherwise you end up with a really long sermon that people eventually lose interest in. Risk, of course, of any teaching with a lot of facts, it can become boring and it can become confusing, particularly if those facts that are being taught are irrelevant or unnecessary. So again, talking about individual scenes, what to put in a scene. Emotion. Sometimes it's good to put emotion into a scene. So you might want to tell a story that has some emotion, or you might want to read something quietly with emotion or loudly with emotion, because emotion can uplift, it can encourage, it can convict, it can transform. Of course, emotion can annoy people. It can make people angry if you get it wrong. It can upset people, and it's worth bearing that in mind. So emotion's good, but actually at times it can be quite bad. I remember I invited a friend to church years ago, and he was in uni with me and he was thinking about becoming a Christian. He was exploring the idea. So I invited him to church, and the guy giving the sermon was a nice guy. He was a Queenslander. This was in South Australia, and just in case you haven't figured out, Queenslanders and South Australians are quite different. South Australians are much more reserved, Queenslanders are much more direct. And so someone who's from Queensland who's direct will come across as very rude and overbearing in South Australia to a lot of people. And I guess someone in South Australia might come across as
Didn't know that.
Sheltered.
Yeah, why is that person not saying calling a spade a spade? Anyway,
This sounds like Queensland, isn't it?
so this particular guy was giving the sermon that week, and he got up and he started talking about hell, and he was really emotional, and you need to repent. And my friend got up and walked out halfway through the sermon, and I followed him out and said, "Oh, I'm sorry about that." And he said, I didn't come to church just to be yelled at. And he never went back to church. Still not a Christian to this day. Now, it's not the person who gave the sermon, it's not his fault, but he certainly didn't help. So using emotions good, but got to be careful with it. So I'm just going to play a few ones from a YouTube clip.